presentation, we're going to be hearing a report that was created by Tonya, Gonnella, Frichner on the 13th UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And among your materials in the folder is the Haudenosaunee Intervention on Principles of Good Governance that was delivered by Ron Lyons just last week. Also, we have the other interventions up there at the table just as you enter the building. But right now, I'd like to invite Betty Lyons. First, let me say a few words about Tonya. There is a bio of the speakers on the back side of your schedule. And Tonya is the founder, is a citizen of the Onondaga Nation, also the director of the American Indian Law Alliance. And we'll be hearing from Betty Lyons, who is also a citizen of the Onondaga Nation and a member of the American Indian Law Alliance. Sounds strangely familiar. So, yes, after this presentation, we'll take a little break.
Thank you for having me, and I'll try to make this brief, because I know you're all sitting on hard chairs and you need a little break. But first, I wanted to say that sometimes Sid mentions our son, who's 13, our oldest son, and talking about the lake and how polluted it is when we were driving past it. He was probably about 6 years old. So we're driving past it, and you can smell that smell. There's no getting away from it. And so he wanted to know why they weren't cleaning it up, why Honeywell wasn't going to clean it up, what the problem was. And I said, well, they don't want to spend the money to clean up the lake. And he looked at me and he said, and I get choked up when I say this, he said, did they tell the fish that? He's only 6 years old. So with that, now I will move on to the other brief thing that I wanted to say. That there are a lot of people in this room that have really worked so tirelessly for the nation and for our causes. Phil, and, Sandy, Sue, Paul, Joe. And yes, Joe, okay, maybe he's an employee of the nation, but let me just tell you that he works harder than any human being that I know on the face of this earth for us and our causes. And, I get emails from him at 11 o'clock at night and again at 5 in the morning. Love you, Joe. Like, wow. So, it's intense. Like, I thought I always had some energy, but he totally outworked. So, I'm giving this today, this report for my Aunt Tonya, as she couldn't be here because the permanent forum is wrapping up. So, I'm going to give you a little background about the Haudenosaunee and our history with the United Nations. In 1923, Hugo Chief Descahe traveled to Geneva, Switzerland to speak at the League of Nations, that's what it was known at that time, using a Haudenosaunee passport, which now they don't recognize. In 1977, a delegation again traveled to Geneva to address the United Nations, and finally 13 years ago, the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues began. And it began as an advisory body to the Economic and Social Council with a mandate to discuss indigenous issues related to economic and social development, culture, the environment, education, health, and human rights. The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted by the General Assembly on Thursday, the 13th of September 2007 by a majority of 144 states. In favor and 4 votes against. And I'm pretty sure that you can all guess and imagine who the 4 member states were that didn't want to sign on. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the United States. So the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples can also be found on the United Nations website. The 13th session of the Permanent Forum took place May 12th to the 23rd at the UN headquarters in New York City, with a special theme this year on principles of good governance, consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Articles 3 to 6 and 46. There was a preparatory meeting on Friday, May 9th, 10th, and 11th. So we have a Women's Indigenous Caucus meeting that prepares for this, and then they were also 2 days where the indigenous caucuses meet together collectively to try to come up with a plan as, how we're going to get through the next 2 weeks, which are very long and exhausting. The delegation from the Haudenosaunee Nation, Haudenosaunee and Onondaga Nation were Oren Lyons, Tadadaho Sid Hill, and Tracy Shenandoah. And Sid opened the forum again, as he does every year, and Tracy Shenandoah translated into English, and then the UN translated into all the official languages. The afternoon session began addressing the special theme for the year, Principles of Good Governance, consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And during the discussion of the special theme of the year, Ed John presented his study entitled Study on the Impacts of the Doctrine of Discovery on Indigenous Peoples, including mechanisms, processes, and instruments of redress with reference to the Declaration. Oren Lyons made an intervention on May 14th. I was going to call him Uncle Sonny, but he didn't know what I was talking about. And which brought forth perspectives as well as the issues facing the Haudenosaunee under the special theme focusing on the principles of good governance. Through the intervention, the Haudenosaunee was able to highlight the Onondaga petition to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights that was filed, as Joe said, April 15th, 2014, and after having exhausted all legal remedies with the U.S. federal judicial system, we were advised by the U.S. District Court of Appeals, as Joe had said, that it was too late and that they were going to apply latches to that. So the archaic concept of latches was applied, claiming that we waited too long and that it was too late to seek justice and our claim would be disruptive on our neighbors. The Haudenosaunee protested the taking of our land since the beginning of the illegal thefts of our lands and territories as it was our right. And we ask, is it too late for healing between our people? Is it too late to clean up the waters, the land, and the air? Is it too late to save the birds and the animals that are dying from that contamination? We certainly hope not, because we have always believed that we can have healing between our people and others, and it is time to let the history be known and acknowledge what happened between our people. This was an important opportunity which allowed the American Indian Law Alliance to introduce Oren Lyons to meet with the Executive Secretary for the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, who was able to speak with Oren Lyons and Ayla regarding the recent filed petition. And we gave him a copy of the basic call to consciousness. So while we're there, you have to work the room and try to get your position out there. The Doctrine of Discovery intervention recognized the Doctrine of Discovery and the long-term effects on our peoples, and raised the fact that the Doctrine of Discovery led to the atrocities we faced in residential and boarding schools, both in Canada and the United States. The Haudenosaunee requested a study on the boarding schools of Indigenous children in the United States and around the world, and drew attention to the fact that the removal of Indigenous children from their families and communities was legislated through the authorization of the state with its root in the Doctrine of Discovery. The intervention, in particular, took note of the effect on Indigenous youth, which includes high rates of youth suicide, the apprehension of Indigenous children from their families, and poor access to education. The intervention raised the fact that in Haudenosaunee territory, we continue to work for the cleanup of our territories as affirmed under Article 3, the right to self-determination of the UNDRIP regarding the Onondaga Nation's unilateral cleanup of our territories. And the Haudenosaunee intervention recommended the cleanup of Onondaga Lake and Onondaga Creek be viewed as a best practice of Indigenous governance, and we recommended other Indigenous nations and peoples look at this cleanup as a possible model for cleanups in other Indigenous territories. Finally, regarding the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and recognition of the universal right to self-determination, the Haudenosaunee recommended that the claim that self-determination is somehow different for Indigenous peoples, as asserted by some member states, be strongly rejected as untrue, discriminatory on its face, and inconsistent with the United Nations Charter and established international law. Indigenous peoples are equal to all other peoples. And I thought that it was so sad that it took so long for them to use the word peoples. Like, they kept identifying us as populations, we weren't even considered human beings. To, recently, this isn't 100 years ago, this is, this is how they think of us today. I mean, It's shocking, it's sad, it's depressing, and so that's what we battle all the time. And as you said, my Aunt Tonya, who is the president and co-founder or founder of the American Indian Law Alliance, has been doing this work for a long time, and she's now fighting stage 4 breast cancer. And she still managed to go every single day to this forum and work diligently, tirelessly, to promote these issues. It's really amazing. I watch all these people that work so hard. It's really amazing. So I hope to be like that. We also went to a side event, which was called Don't Feed the Indians, which, when the filmmaker was talking about his film, it just made me think of that. So it's kind of a comedy, and it's regarding the doctrine of discovery, and it was really quite funny. And I hope that we can bring that here so that people can see, it really just makes it so absurd, right, how we're treated. It's a comedic look at the negative marginalization of indigenous peoples and the appropriation of indigenous culture and intellectual property. So May 15th featured a half-day discussion on the Asian region featuring interventions from indigenous peoples from across Asia, detailing their worldviews and visions, as well as the serious human rights violations they are facing at the hands of states and extractive industries. In the afternoon, there was a comprehensive dialogue with the United Nations agencies and funds, which allowed indigenous delegates to address UN agencies regarding policy in which limits the UN agencies to only assist indigenous peoples in developing countries and revise the policy to allow us in all countries, developed and developing, access support from the UN agencies and funds. This intervention was made in consideration of the extreme inequality facing indigenous peoples in developed countries. The 16th featured a discussion on ongoing priorities and themes and follow-up for indigenous children and youth. And this amazing girl, she gave this speech at the United Nations 2 years ago? Her name is Takaya Blaney. She's just, this little girl has such an old soul. She's just the most amazing little girl I've ever seen in my life. And she gave an intervention on behalf of Native children's survival. And the American Indian Law Alliance and 7th Generation Fund helped her to write this. This moving intervention called for the formation of an Indigenous Children's Fund. An annual Honor to People Social was held at the American Indian Community House with distinguished indigenous nations from around the world, and Oren Alliance was awarded this year's award for that, and unfortunately wasn't there to accept it, as he's often taken elsewhere. The second week began on the 19th with a discussion on the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, which featured a representative of the Office of the President of the General Assembly, who offered an update on the preparation on the high-level plenary meeting on the World Conference. On the 20th, the topic was human rights and implementation on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because it's obviously not implemented by all member states, only those that choose and are willing to do so. And the dialogue with a special rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. And there were presentations from the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples, the voluntary fund, and the chair of the committee of the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. Wednesday the 21st were ongoing priorities and themes and follow-up regarding the second international decade of the world's indigenous peoples and the developmental agenda. Future work was Thursday's topic, change of the name of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to the Permanent Forum on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so, like I said, this word peoples. So we're an issue, right? We're a population, we're not peoples. Future work of the Permanent Forum, including emerging issues, permanent observer status. Under this agenda item, the American Indian Law Alliance, the Haudenosaunee, and others offered a joint intervention which recommended permanent observer status be given serious consideration for all indigenous nations. We recognize that the Haudenosaunee and other indigenous nations and peoples have continued to express their fundamental right to self-determination and their original unbroken right to sovereignty over lands, resources, and territories. We drew attention to the permanent observer status of entities which have received a standing invitation to participate as permanent observers in the sessions and the work of the General Assembly while maintaining permanent observers at the UN headquarters, such as the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See, the Permanent Observer Mission of Palestine, and we stated that indigenous peoples and nations cannot be locked into a minor position, and our position has always been and always will be that we are equal to all peoples and all nations. There was also a side event regarding screening of the Cherokee word for water. This was the final side event that was done on Friday, and it was co-sponsored by the Ford Foundation, and this film inspired by the remarkable true story that tells of one woman's quest to bring running water to Cherokee families in the rural Cherokee Nation, using the traditional concept of working together to solve a problem. Wilma Mankiller inspired and led a community of volunteers to improve their own living conditions in the face of stiff opposition. She then went on to become the first woman to head the Cherokee Nation. And the panel after the film featured Charlie Soap, husband of the late Wilma Mankiller, Orrin Lyons, producer Christina Keel, and the esteemed panel was moderated by Tonya Gonnella Frichner. So the last day of the forum was the adoption of the report of the permanent forum on its 13th session. Indigenous peoples will not be able to participate in the HLP session, only states, nor participate in the final drafting of the outcome document, which is very dangerous for indigenous peoples and nations, and states will determine our fate without us in the final report. So they're always trying to keep us excluded out of this process. The chair announced that a study on border crossing issues will be presented next year at the permanent forum, and this is a very important issue. This is one that we're battling all the time with our passport issue. The American Indian Law Alliance has been requesting this since 2010 when Tonya was the North American rep to the permanent forum. And lastly, I would just like to say that my beautiful aunt is receiving an award at the 12th Annual Drums Along the Hudson. It's a festival given in New York City. It's I'll be able to give you that information for all of her hard work and her dedication. And like I said, I just find it amazing that these people, with everything that they go through, they find the time and the energy to just keep at it and keep working, because it's just so much a part of them. So thank you for letting me give her report, and I hope you have a great day.
Let's take a break.
Yes.
And if you have questions or comments, maybe we can use the break as a time to share. All right? Okay.